Wild Mustang meets autistic girl in wheelchair. Their unbelievable bond will leave you speechless. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm, golden hue over the sprawling meadow. The sky above was painted with shades of orange and pink, the soft light bouncing off the wild terrain. A cool breeze rustled through the tall grasses, and the sound of nature echoed across the quiet landscape. Chirping birds, the rustling of leaves, and, in the distance, the thunderous rhythm of hooves striking the earth. The wild Mustangs ran freely across the land, their powerful bodies moving with the grace and strength of creatures born to roam. They moved in unison, like a living wave, their long, untamed manes flying behind them in the wind, their hooves kicking up dust as they raced across the meadow. Their freedom was absolute, untethered by anything or anyone, and for a moment, it seemed like the entire world paused to watch them, to admire their untamed beauty. At the far edge of this picturesque scene, in stark contrast to the wild horses, sat a young girl in a wheelchair. Ella, with her soft chestnut hair tucked behind her ears, sat silently, her eyes locked on the horses in the distance. The breeze brushed her hair back, but her body remained still. Her wheelchair, which usually made her feel confined, now seemed to be an almost invisible part of her, as her entire focus was drawn to the Mustangs that ran across the open field. Ella, at just 10 years old, had always been a quiet child, her world often too overwhelming to fully engage with. Diagnosed with autism, Ella struggled with the noise and chaos of everyday life. The simplest changes in her routine could send her into a spiral of frustration, and the world often felt like a confusing and unpredictable place. Her parents, Clara and Mark, watched her from behind with quiet concern, wondering if their daughter would ever be able to connect in a meaningful way with the world around her. For months, they had tried everything: therapies, visits to doctors, special programs, all in an attempt to help Ella find some semblance of peace or joy. But nothing seemed to work. Ella rarely smiled, and when she did, it was fleeting, like a star appearing briefly in a dark sky. Her life was one of quiet isolation, and her parents' hearts ached for her. They wished for a way to reach her, to see her truly connect with something outside of her own mind. But that day, as the wild Mustangs thundered across the field, something was different. There was a quiet energy in the air, something that felt like a whisper, an invitation. As Ella sat in her wheelchair, her fingers lightly drumming on the armrest, she didn't speak. Her eyes, however, didn't waver from the horizon. She was fully immersed in the sight before her, and for the first time in a long time, she seemed to be more than just an observer in her own world. She seemed to be present, connected to something bigger than herself. Ella was a girl of few words, and even fewer smiles. Her autism often made it difficult for her to communicate or interact with the world around her. She was a quiet presence in a busy world, and her days were often filled with solitude. The noise of the outside world, the sounds, the chatter, the movement, was too much to process, and it left her feeling isolated, as though there was an invisible barrier between her and the rest of humanity. Her parents, Clara and Mark, had long since accepted that Ella's world was different from theirs, but they couldn't help but wonder if there was a way to bring her out of her shell, to find something that would resonate with her, something that would give her a sense of peace and belonging. And then came the horses. The visit to the Wild Horse Sanctuary had been an attempt to introduce Ella to the natural world, hoping that perhaps the peaceful surroundings and the majesty of the Mustangs would offer her some comfort. But when they arrived, Ella remained distant and detached, as she often did. She didn't interact with the environment, and her gaze barely moved from the quiet stillness of her surroundings. But as her parents observed her from a distance, they saw something shift. Her eyes, which had been dull and distant for so long, now held a glimmer of something else. There was a spark of curiosity, a flicker of something more. As the Mustangs galloped across the field, Ella's gaze followed their every move. She didn't blink or look away. Her focus was intense, almost as if she were drawn into the very essence of their being. For the first time, she seemed to be engaged, deeply so, and her parents couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. Just as Clara and Mark were beginning to notice the subtle shift in their daughter, something extraordinary happened. Out of the herd of wild Mustangs, one horse broke away from the group. A stunning black and white Mustang with a coat that shimmered like the night sky. Unlike the others, who scattered in every direction, this particular horse moved deliberately toward Ella. The Mustang's movement was smooth, almost hypnotic, his hooves striking the earth with a rhythm that seemed to resonate with the pulse of the world itself. His dark, intelligent eyes locked onto Ella, and it felt as though time slowed down. The Mustang didn't seem afraid. There was no hesitance in his step, no uncertainty. It was as if he had made a conscious decision to approach Ella, to seek her out, and there was a quiet grace in his actions that captivated everyone who witnessed it. Ella's parents stood frozen in place, their eyes wide with disbelief. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she watched the wild Mustang approach their daughter. "Why is he coming toward her?" Clara whispered, unable to tear her eyes away from the scene. Mark, equally stunned, could only reply, It's like he's chosen her." The Mustang's steady steps drew him closer to Ella. The air was thick with anticipation, and every movement seemed amplified in the silence. Ella didn't move, didn't say a word. Her gaze remained fixed on the horse, her heart racing in a way that felt completely different from anything she had ever experienced. There was no fear, no hesitation, only a strange sense of calm that seemed to fill the space between them. And then, just as the Mustang closed the distance, Ella did something that no one expected. She didn't recoil or pull away. Instead, her hand slowly moved toward the horse, as though instinctively reaching for something she had always known was there but could never quite touch. As her fingers inched closer, the wild Mustang stopped. He didn't flinch, didn't shy away. Instead, he lowered his head slightly, as if offering her the choice to come closer, to touch him, to connect. The world held its breath. It was in that moment that the connection was made. Silent, profound, and deeply emotional. Ella's hand hovered over the Mustang's sleek, glossy coat, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't alone in her world. She was seen, understood, and, in some quiet way, heard. The Mustang had chosen her, and in doing so, had unlocked a part of Ella's soul that had long remained closed. The wild Mustang's hooves struck the ground with a rhythmic thud as he closed the distance between himself and Ella. His powerful frame moved with a fluidity that felt almost surreal, his muscles rippling beneath his coat with every step. There was something magnetic about him, something undeniable that seemed to draw him to Ella in a way that no one could explain. With every second, the tension in the air grew thicker. The other Mustangs in the herd had halted, standing in the distance as though they, too, understood the significance of what was unfolding. Not a single one moved. It was as if they were waiting, watching this moment between Ella and the lone black and white Mustang. Ella's eyes never left him. Her gaze was steady, her breath slow and measured as her fingers, once drumming against the armrest of her wheelchair, now rested gently on the edge. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, yet there was no fear, no anxiety, only a deep, inexplicable calm. She had never felt so in tune with something in her life. As the Mustang's dark eyes locked onto hers, she sensed that he wasn't just a creature of flesh and bone. He was something more, a spirit, presence, and they were about to meet in a way that no one could have anticipated. Clara stood frozen, her hand covering her mouth in disbelief. Mark, look at this," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the wind. "He's coming to her." Mark, unable to tear his eyes away, simply nodded. His heart raced in his chest, but he couldn't bring himself to move. It was as though the whole world had gone quiet, and only Ella and the Mustang existed in that moment. As the Mustang reached the edge of the small patch of grass where Ella sat, he slowed his gait. The air around them seemed to vibrate with something electric, as though time itself had come to a standstill. His eyes, deep and dark, were locked on Ella's with an intensity that felt like he was seeing straight into her soul. There was no fear, no hesitation. His presence was calm, steady, like he knew exactly why he was here. Ella's hand twitched, and for a split second, Her fingers hovered just above her lap. Her parents, still in shock, could barely breathe. In a moment of sheer wonder, it was as if everything else in the world, her autism, her challenges, the struggles they'd faced, simply faded away. Then, with no warning, Ella slowly reached her hand out. It was tentative at first, unsure, as if she was testing the very air between them. The Mustang remained still, but his gaze never wavered from her. It was a quiet exchange, a conversation of the soul. No words, just a powerful, undeniable connection. Ella's fingertips brushed against the sleek coat of the Mustang. Her breath caught in her throat, her eyes wide in awe. The Mustang's fur was warm, and beneath her touch, she could feel the strong, steady beat of his heart, a rhythm that seemed to echo her own. It was as if their hearts were beating in sync, as though they were two beings that had been destined to find one another. For the briefest of moments, Ella closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel the magic of the connection. A wave of warmth washed over her, something she had never felt before. A sense of peace, of belonging, of being understood. The world outside her body, her condition, the limits that had been set for her, all of it melted away. She wasn't just a girl in a wheelchair anymore. She was someone with a bond that was as real and as powerful as anything she had ever known. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the moment held its breath. Ella's fingers were still lightly grazing the Mustang's coat, but her hand froze in place. The Mustang stood perfectly still, his body tense, his gaze unwavering. Neither moved. The silence around them deepened, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Clara and Mark, their hearts pounding in their chests, took a tentative step forward. They could hardly believe their eyes. Was this really happening? Had their daughter, the girl who had struggled for so long to connect, just found something or someone that could reach her? The wild Mustang's body seemed to shimmer in the fading light, the golden sun casting a soft glow on his coat, as if to say, this is the moment. This is the reason. Ella's breath was slow, steady, and her hand hovered just above the Mustang's coat, unsure whether to pull back or press closer. The tension in the air felt like a string pulled taut, each second stretching longer than the last. And in that suspended moment, the Mustang, his eyes still locked with Ella's, slowly began to lower his head, his ears flicking back in a gentle, almost reassuring manner, as if he were saying to Ella, I'm here. I understand. You are safe. In the days following that fateful encounter, Ella's family made regular trips to the sanctuary, each visit marking a new chapter in the growing relationship between the young girl and the Mustang. The once quiet, reserved girl now looked forward to each moment spent with Spirit, her wheelchair no longer a barrier to the world around her. At first, Ella's visits were brief, her nerves still raw from the intensity of their first connection. But with each passing day, her confidence grew. Spirit was always waiting for her, standing by the edge of the sanctuary, his dark eyes following her approach. And every time she arrived, his steady presence seemed to reassure her. It was as though he knew exactly what she needed. One day, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the sky in soft shades of pink and orange, Ella wheeled herself toward the enclosure where Spirit stood. He was there, just like he always was, his strong, powerful body outlined against the fading light. But today there was something different, something new. Spirit turned to face her, his tail swishing with anticipation. As if knowing that this day was special, he stepped forward, taking a few hesitant strides toward her. Ella's heart skipped a beat as she felt a spark of excitement in the pit of her stomach. Slowly, almost reverently, she reached out her hand, fingers trembling, and Spirit came closer. Her mother, Clara, watched in awe from the distance. She had never seen her daughter this eager, this full of life. It's like she's a different person, she whispered to Mark, who was standing beside her, a lump forming in his throat. In that moment it was clear. Ella wasn't just visiting Spirit. She was connecting with him, growing with him in ways that no one could have predicted. The transformation in Ella was nothing short of extraordinary. The girl who had once struggled with social interactions and found comfort in isolation was now blossoming in ways her parents never thought possible. It wasn't just the visits to the sanctuary that were changing her. It was Spirit. Ella had found in him not just a friend, but a guide, a protector, someone who understood her without words. She began to express herself more freely, speaking with a newfound confidence. At home, she would share stories about Spirit, describing every little detail with excitement. His wild, untamed spirit, the way his coat shimmered in the sunlight, the rhythm of his hooves as he ran across the field. Her mother could see the spark returning to her eyes, the spark that had been dimmed for so long. Ella was speaking more, laughing more, and even venturing out of her comfort zone in ways that shocked her family. The world that once seemed so overwhelming now appeared a little smaller, a little more inviting. Clara watched her daughter, her heart swelling with pride. It was as though Spirit had unlocked something inside Ella that no one had been able to reach. And it wasn't just Ella who had changed. Mark, too, began to notice the profound effect Spirit had on their daughter. He could see how the Mustang's presence seemed to soothe Ella, grounding her in a way that nothing else had. But it wasn't just the emotional shift that was taking place. Ella's physical health began to improve, too. The anxiety that had once gripped her every time they left the house started to lessen. She began to venture out more even on her own. Each visit to the sanctuary was a step forward, not only in her emotional growth, but in her ability to navigate the world with greater independence. As their bond deepened, Spirit's protective nature began to reveal itself in subtle, yet powerful ways. It was as though he had taken it upon himself to watch over Ella, sensing when she needed comfort and when she needed space. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the field, Ella rolled her wheelchair to the edge of the sanctuary, where Spirit was grazing. Without a sound, the Mustang raised his head, his ears flicking as he sensed Ella's presence. But something wasn't right. Ella had been feeling unusually tired that day, the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders more than usual. As she wheeled herself closer to Spirit, she noticed her heart was racing a little faster than it should. It wasn't a panic attack, but it was a deep sense of discomfort, a wave of unease that washed over her. Before she could fully react, Spirit trotted toward her with a speed that left Clara and Mark in shock. He stopped right in front of Ella, his broad frame blocking the sun's fading rays, casting a shadow over her. He lowered his head to her level, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed her gently. Ella smiled weakly, placing her hand on his soft muzzle. It was as though Spirit knew something was off, and he was there to protect her, to shield her from whatever was causing her distress. As if to reassure her, Spirit nudged Ella's wheelchair forward, his touch gentle but insistent, guiding her away from the center of the field, toward the edge where they could rest. His instincts were keen, and it was clear he was not just a Mustang. He was more than that. He was a guardian, a protector, a companion who understood Ella in ways no one else ever could. And as the day wound down, with the sky turning a deep shade of purple, Ella felt a sense of peace she had never experienced before. The connection she shared with Spirit had grown beyond friendship. It was something far deeper, something spiritual. Together, they had created a safe space, a world where words didn't matter, only the bond between them. And as long as they were together, Ella knew she was never truly alone. It was a seemingly ordinary afternoon when the skies began to change. A soft breeze had picked up earlier in the day, but no one had anticipated the sudden shift in weather. As the sun began its descent, dark clouds gathered ominously on the horizon, casting an eerie shadow over the sanctuary. The air grew thick, charged with a heaviness that felt like a storm was imminent. Ella, sitting in her wheelchair near the edge of the field, felt a strange unease settle in her chest. She had always been sensitive to the weather, her body reacting to the changes in the air. As she looked out over the field where Spirit had been grazing just moments ago, she noticed that he was nowhere in sight. The gentle winds that had been rustling the leaves of nearby trees had now turned into gusts, making the branches sway violently. "Clara! Something feels off." Ella's voice trembled slightly, her hand instinctively gripping the armrest of her wheelchair. Her mother, sensing the same tension, stood up from her seat, scanning the sky with growing concern. Just then, the storm broke. A fierce gust of wind howled across the sanctuary, sending debris scattering through the air. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first drops of rain began to fall, quickly turning into a torrential downpour. The storm had come on so suddenly, no one had time to react. Clara rushed to Ella, her heart racing with panic. The wind whipped around them, and the rain poured down in sheets, turning the ground beneath their feet into a slippery, treacherous mess. It was difficult to see through the storm, and Ella's wheelchair, though sturdy, was struggling against the rising wind and mud. "Ella, we need to get to shelter. Quickly," Clara shouted, her voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. But Ella, looking out into the distance, didn't move. "Mom, where's Spirit?" Ella asked, her eyes wide with fear and worry. Her heart raced, her thoughts clouded with concern. Spirit had always been by her side, and now, in the midst of this storm, he was nowhere to be found. Clara scanned the field, her eyes squinting through the rain, but there was no sign of the Mustang. The storm had made everything uncertain, and the world around them had become a whirlwind of noise and chaos. Suddenly, a sharp, ear-piercing cry cut through the storm, followed by the heavy sound of hooves pounding the earth. Ella's heart skipped a beat. Through the curtain of rain, a figure emerged. It was Spirit. With a speed and determination Ella had never seen before, Spirit galloped through the storm, his powerful legs kicking up mud and water as he rushed toward them. The wind howled louder, but Spirit didn't hesitate. His eyes were fixed on Ella, unwavering and strong, as if he had sensed her fear and was coming to protect her. "Spirit," Ella called out, her voice trembling with a mix of relief and awe. But as the Mustang drew closer, the storm grew fiercer. A lightning strike suddenly illuminated the sky, followed by an ear-splitting crack of thunder. The ground shook beneath them, and in that instant, Ella's wheelchair got stuck in the mud. Panic surged in her chest as the rain continued to pour, and the storm's intensity increased. Ella's world had become a whirlwind of chaos and fear. Her hands gripped the wheels of her chair, trying desperately to free herself, but the muddy terrain was unforgiving. She was trapped, her wheelchair unable to move, and the storm closing in around her like a wall. Just as Ella's panic threatened to overwhelm her, Spirit reached her side. His powerful frame, soaked and wild from the storm, stood protectively in front of her, his head lowered, his body blocking the worst of the wind and rain. Without hesitation, he nudged her wheelchair gently but firmly, his nose pressing against the handles with a force that left no room for doubt. Ella's heart raced, a wave of trust flooding her. With Spirit's powerful presence shielding her, she took a deep breath, steadied herself, and gently gripped the wheels once more. Spirit was there, no longer just a friend, but a protector, guiding her through the storm. With a mighty push, Spirit urged the wheelchair forward, using his strength to pull Ella through the thick, muddy terrain. Together, they fought against the elements, Spirit's hooves slamming against the ground with a rhythm that was both steady and relentless. His powerful body pushed Ella forward, the wheelchair finally moving despite the storm's fury. With Spirit by her side, Ella is no longer just a girl in a wheelchair. She is a symbol of resilience, a beacon of hope to anyone who feels lost or broken. Her journey is proof that sometimes the greatest miracles happen when we least expect them, and that the most profound moments of growth happen when we learn to trust, not just in others, but in ourselves. The story of Ella and Spirit is a story of friendship, transformation, and the incredible power of a bond that transcends words, a bond that can change lives forever. And as their story comes to an end, we are reminded that, no matter where we are in life, we too can find the courage to change, to grow, and to believe in the possibility of a new beginning.